Hi, everybody. Continuing the long list of fantastic guests on my show, I've got another fantastic guest today. Dinesh D'Souza is one of the most prolific scholars, if not in the United States, anywhere. I was trying to prepare my introduction, and I stopped counting at around 13 or 14 books. Can you tell us what is the actual official count, Dinesh?
Gosh, Gad, I'm not positive, but I think it's somewhere around 17 or 18 books. I've sort of lost count. I think I've become a little bit of a windbag with no sign of stopping. So I'm starting to cook up a new one even now. But no, the books have been my bread and butter since I left the Reagan White House. This was at the very end of the Reagan years. And I went to the American Enterprise Institute. I decided, look, instead of being just a journalist, I'll try to be an author and develop a kind of field of interest. And my topic has been largely speaking America in various phases and dimensions of it, the economic side, the political side. I wrote a book on Reagan. So that's been perhaps the unifying theme of my work, although I've done forays also into Christian apologetics. Well, there you go. That's probably my most hefty book of all.
Thank you so much for sending it to me. What the hell is going on? We don't judge the books by the number of inches of its width, but what the hell, man? I mean, what is going... By the way, thank you very much for the lovely inscription inside. That was very kind of you. Let me just mention, for those of you who may not know all of... I'm not going to mention everything. It'll take a whole hour. You're a Dartmouth College alumnus. You may or may not know that I was a visiting professor at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. And
I did not know that. That is cool.
Yeah, 2002. Yeah. So way after you had finished. So we certainly didn't overlap. I'm a bit younger than you, but I had a great time. Although I found that, I did my MS and PhD at Cornell. Ithaca is a small town, but it's a lot bigger than Hanover. So how were you able to handle undergraduate life in that monastic place?
I didn't know anything about it. I mean, you have to remember that I came to America at the age of 17 as an exchange student. I lived in Arizona with a host family. I went to a small public school with 30 students in the senior class. The only reason I ended up in college is my high school counselor came up to me one day and he basically said, I'm doing nothing. Most of our kids will go to the local university down the street or they won't go to college at all. So you are now my project for the year. So this is a guy who kind of shepherded me through the application process. He chose Dartmouth, Yale, a bunch of other colleges for me to apply to. I had never been out east, so I picked the college I ended up attending pretty much out of the pictures in the catalog.
Well, if that was your cue for choosing, I don't know if you know, but the Cornell campus has been repeatedly chosen as the most beautiful campus in the United States. So maybe you didn't look at those photos carefully enough, because I don't know if you've ever been to Ithaca or to Cornell. It is out of this world. It's like from Lord of the Rings.
It is beautiful. I mean, the Ivies are by and large gorgeous campuses. I lived in Princeton for a year after I graduated. I worked for an alumni magazine there. And of course, that's a beautiful campus. That Princeton Cathedral is awesome. Hanover is a lovely place and attracts a little different kind of student than the rest of the Ivies, a little bit more of the all-round student that likes to ski and go hiking in the Appalachian Mountains. I actually ended up embracing that kind of ethos of Dartmouth, the all-round student, and I also got involved with a rebel conservative newspaper over there, which was a thorn in the side of the college administration.
Well, I often play a game with my wife where, we just say, what if Dartmouth were to come to me now with a, tenured position, would we go today? And I think that 20 years ago when I was a visiting professor there, it might have been a place that I would have been happy to be at, raise, we have young children and so on. But today, even though it's pretty close to, I guess, Boston, two and a half hours away? Does that sound right?
Yes.
It strikes me as a bit too isolating, but I want to go back to your to the bio just to cover it. So you were a former policy analyst for Reagan. I'd love to talk about Reagan for a bit. Served as president of King's College for a few years, then you stepped down. I'll just mention a few of the books: Illiberal Education, The End of Racism, which I mentioned earlier, a book on Reagan, The Virtue of Prosperity, What's So Great About America, What's So Great About Christianity. Then we got into a couple of books on Obama. We could talk about that as well. And then I stopped at 2014, America, Imagine a World Without Her. You've been a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and you've released several very, high-grossing documentaries. So you've worn many hats, right? You've been a policy analyst, you've been a pundit, you've been a TV or a podcast host, an author, a documentarian. I'm sure you love all of these, but is there one that today you love more than the others, and if so, why?
I wouldn't say that I love one more than the others. Part of it has been to kind of find my groove in each of the things that I do. So I started out as an author and speaker. Now, the speaking was a kind of spin-off of the writing books. My first book, Illiberal Education, which was kind of the book that brought the idea of political correctness into the public spotlight. I suddenly found myself sitting on like 300 speaking invitations from universities all around the country. I had to kind of hire an agent. So I suddenly realized I've now become kind of a campus speaker. I hadn't planned on it, but it became part of my operation. And so I was for many years kind of at a think tank. I was a writer and speaker. And I started the movies only in 2012. So although I've now done 5 of them, it was a relatively later addition to my career. And it came about, again, by complete accident. A fellow was talking to me, and he said, look, I'd like to support your work. I want your books to reach 1 million people. And I said, Guy, look, nonfiction books don't reach 1 million people typically, with very rare exceptions. A book is doing really well if it sells 100,000 copies. You're like number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. And so this guy goes, well, how do you reach 1 million people? And I said, well, I kind of said, look at Michael Moore. This guy made Fahrenheit 9/11, dropped it in the middle of the 2004 election. That's how you do it. So this guy was like, listen, why don't you check it out? Maybe you can do the same thing. And that was the way I kind of got into the movie business. And so I've tried to excel at each of the things I do, be a really good writer. I pay a lot of attention to the craft of writing, the originality of the argument. I do what a lot of writers don't do. I think about my audience. And by that I mean I think about writing in the same entrepreneurial way that somebody might think about selling a bar of soap. Right. Very different than my colleagues at AEI. I once walked into one of my colleagues' offices at AEI, and this guy was writing a book, a very thick book, somewhat similar to The End of Racism, hundreds of pages long, and he was calling it Tranquilitas Ordinis. And I was like, wait, what? And he was like, oh yeah, this means peace through tranquility, or peace and order at the same time. And I said, well, yeah, but why would you give a Latin title to a book, however good it is? Who do you think is going to buy this book? And he looked at me as if, why would I consider a silly question like that? He had given no attention whatever to the audience. This is something that interested him. He thought the title was cool. So many intellectuals, I think, as you know, are like that. They are supply-siders. They produce things that interest them, but they give little or no thought to what's the constituency for what I'm producing? What's the market for what I'm creating?
No, I love that you're saying this, because in chapter 1 of The Parasitic Mind, and maybe some of my viewers will get tired of me repeating the story, but some folks may have never watched it, so I'll repeat it here. I tell the story of being invited to the Stanford Business School back in 2017 to speak. It was an academic talk, and the gentleman who took me out, a colleague who took me out the night before for dinner, said to me, "Oh, I see that you've been on Joe Rogan many times. You're a celebrity and so on. I didn't know all this about you." I said, "Yeah, it's really important to build bridges with the public masses. I want as many people as possible to consume my ideas." And so he looked at me with sort of disdain and said, "Well, at Stanford, we don't do research so that we can appear on Joe Rogan." I said, "Well, what do you mean? You don't think it's a good idea for you to be popularizing your ideas in front of 20 million downloads? It's not an either or. It's not you publish in peer-reviewed journals or you appear on Joe Rogan. How about doing both?" But that disdain that he exhibited is something that I live in academia, right? And it upsets me, it frustrates me, but ultimately I think it's an ego defensive strategy, because what they're basically saying, I can't go on Joe Rogan and make myself exciting enough for 20 million people to listen to me. Therefore, I will denigrate it and continue producing titles that have Latin in them, because then I can be highfalutin along with my colleagues.
Yeah, I really do think that in modern academia, being obscure is seen as a sign of intelligence. If someone can, if you write in clear prose, and there are some academics who do, someone that I've done several debates with on campuses around the country, Stanley Fish, a world famous literary scholar, one of the leading Milton scholars in the world. Now, Stanley Fish is a beautiful, even a lyrical writer, and he can deliver even academic prose with a great sense of aphorism. He knows how to write the short and the long sentences. He's very punchy. He's combative. He's polemical. But at the same time, he's erudite. But he's not typical. The typical literary scholar loves the idea of taking you down such a maze, such a Byzantine thicket, that after a while you conclude, I don't know what's going on, but I'm assuming the writer does. He must just be so much smarter than I am.
Well, let me build on what you just said. So, in again, not to plug my own book, but I want to at least cite myself so that people know where it's coming from. In The Parasitic Mind, I tell the story of Michel Foucault, one of the grand bullshitters of postmodernism. So I call them the three French holy bullshitters: Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, and Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault is talking to John Searle, the well-renowned American philosopher. And John Searle says to him, how come when I speak to you in person, it seems like I understand what you're saying and you make sense. And yet when I read your stuff, you get lost within the first couple of words. He goes, well, it's because in France, if you don't confuse people, then they don't take you seriously. So there is a built-in obscurantism within the writing, because it's not just those physicists that write those deep formulas that nobody can understand. Us too in the humanities can come up with incomprehensible gibberish. We're important too. And I genuinely think that that's how all the postmodernist garbage started. It was a way by which they wanted to display how erudite they are. It was full eruditeness, and yet they fooled tons of people for 40, 50 years. What do you think of that theory?
I think that theory is correct, and it's really the theory in part that kept me out of academia. I would get calls in my early career from people like Harvey Mansfield, who was a professor, maybe still is, but is probably emeritus now at Harvard, saying, Dinesh, why don't you do a PhD in political science, and you can have a Harvard PhD, it will always stand you in good stead. And I thought to myself, well, it would if I wanted to go into academia, but number one, there's just way too much political knifing in academia.
And don't I know it?
That's number one. And the second thing is that what you seem to have in these academic fields today, and you mentioned that there's a specialized language in science, and there is. There's also a specialized language in law. Think about, for example, the way a legal brief has its own distinctive way of speaking. And I think you're right that political scientists and literary people said, well, we don't have that in our fields. Right. Well, maybe we need it. Maybe we need our own trade vocabulary that only people who go to the American Historical Association or the American Literary Association convention can understand. And that way people will understand we must be a serious discipline. We've got our own lingo after all.
Do you at all regret that if only because in French we say carte de visite, like your business card, if only for and I don't suggest that anybody do a PhD just so that they could signal that they're a doctor so-and-so, but if only because it would have done, as the prospective professor had said to you, do you regret not having done it, at least it's in your bag?
No, I sort of created my own version of it, and let me explain. I discovered that in the 80s there were these think tanks. Yeah. And the think tanks were sort of like universities, but without students. And some professors might go, well, the best kind, right?
Yeah. I think Thomas Sowell would say that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Thomas Sowell, think of the productivity of a guy like Thomas Sowell, because you're not teaching classes, you sit down, you think. And so the think tanks were created for academically minded people, but academics who had a particular thrust for public policy, who were interested in the application of their ideas to society. And I thought, well, that's me. And I said, how can I make an advantage of not, let's say, pursuing a PhD? Well, the way to do that is to really plunge myself into interdisciplinary work. Yeah. Because obviously if I become an anthropologist, I'm going to focus only on anthropology. If I become an economist, I'll focus just on economics. But if you look at the end of racism, or even some of my work in Christian apologetics, you'll notice there are chapters on physics, chapters on brain science, chapters on philosophy which discuss Kant. So in a way, I've been able to use the kind of podium of the think tanks to do forays into a lot of different fields where I obviously rely on experts in those fields,
Sure.
but I'm able to try to draw links and make connections that you wouldn't normally do in an academic department.
I mean, I love that you mentioned the importance of interdisciplinarity, because I am arguably, if I may say, the epitome of an interdisciplinary academic. I've published, of course, in business journals because I'm housed in a business school. I've published in tons of psychology journals, evolutionary theory, medicine, bibliometrics, economics, precisely because I am what I like to call an intellectual buffet type of guy, meaning that I look at this huge landscape of possibilities and I literally get offended, epistemologically offended, that, I should only be publishing in consumer psychology or in evolutionary psychology. Now, of course, in terms of how the reward mechanisms are built in academia, I have the perfectly wrong CV in that I've often been told by fellow academics, hey, God, you're a whatever, fantastic guy. How come you laid yourself thin all over the place? It comes across as though you're not focused. And my answer is, you mean it's not more impressive that I can publish in top journals in medicine and psychology and business and economics rather than publishing in some very, very narrow stay in your lane field? But the way that academia is built, it's really a world of specialists, and people who'd like to get out of the lane are frowned upon.
That's very true. I mean, even when I was in the political world, I remember when I joined the Reagan administration in early '87. And this was at the heart of the Iran-Contra scandal. So to my horror, I kind of march in there. I've got a huge office. I've got, access to a car. I'm eating in the private mess. And I'm only in my 20s.
Wow.
But the whole administration is paralyzed because they're focused on Iran-Contra. Everything is about Ollie North and everything is about all this stuff. And so nothing is happening. And so I say to myself, why did I join the administration? I'm literally sitting at my desk, twiddling my thumbs. And so what do? I sit down and I write a long essay on Robert Frost, the poetry of Robert Frost, and I want to send it to a prestigious literary journal called the Sewanee Review. But of course, if you're in the government, it has to be approved. So I send it into the legal office of the White House for approval, and I literally get a call from the White House lawyer, and he's really puzzled. He goes, Dinesh, an essay on Robert Frost? And I go, yeah. And he goes, why would you waste your time writing an essay on Robert Frost? And I go, because I have literally nothing to do. And so I figured to myself, why not, write an essay for a literary magazine? And he goes, how do you expect me to even approve this? Because he was supposed to see if this was consistent with Reagan administration policy. And of course, this was an essay about poems like The Road Not Taken. And so he was, I just remember even to this day his bewilderment that any policy guy would do something so far-fetched as write an article, not, let's say, for example, for the National Review or the New Republic, but write an article for an obscure, although very influential, literary journal about poetry.
Don't keep me hanging. Was it cleared and then was it published, or is it sitting somewhere collecting dust?
No, it actually got sort of blocked in the review process because even though this guy liked it, they were like, listen, this may be taken the wrong way. You're kind of you're a figure in the administration, so you may want to hold off. Bottom line of it is, I wasn't able to actually do it, but I did write it.
Going back, so I asked you at the start of this last thread of conversation, I asked you if you regretted that you didn't pursue a PhD. Let me blow up that question of regret in a grander way. And the reason why I like to ask this question is because I'm actually working on my next book, only my 5th book, so I'm just a little spring chicken compared to your productivity. But so in this book, I talk about sort of, a recipe for the good life. That's the tentative title. And one of the chapters is, the ancient Greeks had this concept of ataraxia, tranquility of mind. And if you could, have tranquility of mind, then you've lived a good life. And so I argue that one of the things that can affect our ability to achieve ataraxia is if we are haunted by many regrets. And so here I want to set up, actually, it's one of my former doctoral professors at Cornell. His name is Tom Gilovich, who pioneered the study of psychology of regret in the following way. So he argued and demonstrated through many studies that there are really 2 sources of regret when you ask people, what do you regret most in life? There are regret due to an action. I regret that I was I wasn't, I was mean to my wife and that resulted in our divorce. So it's something that I did that I regret versus regret due to inaction. I've always wanted to be a chef, but yet I went into accounting because my dad is an accountant, and now I feel like my talent has been wasted. And it turns out for long-term regrets, people are much more haunted by regret due to inaction, things that I didn't do than things that I did. Now, we all have things that we regret. So if I were to ask you right now, so far in your life, what are your greatest regrets and do they fit into the action or inaction? What would you answer?
Well, certainly in the sort of professional domain, when I graduated from Dartmouth, I mean, I come from a very kind of traditional Asian American family, you could say. And so when I told my parents I'm thinking of going to Washington to be a journalist, they were like, Dinesh, we suggest you do something productive with your life.
Engineering or doctor, right?
They wanted me to go to business school. I was admitted to the Wharton Business School at that time, maybe still now, the top business school in the country. And they saw me going into a successful career in, the corporate world. But as they saw it, this world of American politics was incomprehensibly strange. And why would their son, raised in a suburb of Mumbai, want to get all mixed up in something that seemed only to bring trouble with it? And so interestingly, it was a pivotal time of my career when I decided to sort of become a writer and kind of go for it and stay with it. And fortunately, I got the job in the White House before my kind of 2-year deferral at the Wharton Business School had, elapsed. So I was able to send my parents a very nice photo of me sitting side by side with Reagan, so that even though they didn't really know what I was doing, they figured I must be doing something. Here I'm sitting right next to the President of the United States. So they were like, okay, son, you can keep going. From a young age, I've been fascinated by literature. I was an English major at Dartmouth. I love the work of Milton, of Dante, obviously the tragedies of the ancient Greeks. And I've often thought to myself that, that writing in the domain of fiction is something I would have loved to do. But what happens, I think, is that because I was really successful, I've been very lucky to be successful in my first attempt of all the major pivots of my life. So my first book, huge bestseller, 15 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I was on every TV show.
This is Illiberal Education.
This is Illiberal Education. Yeah. Then I do my first movie, which was 2016 Obama's America, $30 million in the box office, the second most successful documentary ever made, very influential, put a new idea about Obama out there. So what happened is, ironically, by being drawn into this side of the nonfiction side of writing and being very successful at it, you then, of course, realize that the moment you finish a book, a publisher is breathing down your neck. What's your next book? Yeah. Here's a big fat advance to write that book. And you think to yourself, when am I going to find the year to write a book on fiction where I'm not established, nobody even knows who I am? So the opportunity cost of trying to go down that road becomes very high. And as a result, I've never done it.
Wow. By the way, just you may or may not know this, that you may have not know this, but my Parasitic Mind and my next book are with Regnery. And unless I'm mistaken, you'll correct me, you might be the most prolific and most successful Regnery author ever, right? You probably have 7, 8 books with them. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the Regnery has also gone through some phases over the years. They're very good at what they do. And so it was with Regnery, actually, that I published. I have, in my run of best-selling books, I have 3 #1 New York Times bestsellers. And they all came back to back, and they were all with Regnery.
Fantastic.
So with Regnery, I've had 3 #1 books in a row. And so I've had a really terrific relationship with them. And I'm doing my next book with them as well.
Oh, that's what, I got to tell you, I can easily be personally slighted. Maybe it's partly my personhood. It's partly the Middle East, honor code. And yet, I've never found any reason to be personally slighted by any individual who works for Regnery. Meaning that at every contact point, whether it be the president of Regnery, whether it be my editor at Regnery, whether it be the copy editor, the promotional people, the salespeople, they've all been just A+ folks. So much so that when I was now working on my next book, even though I could have had opportunities, because Parasitic Mind has been very successful, I could have gone elsewhere, maybe gotten a bigger advance. I felt so comfortable with them and so loyal to them that being an author, in part, you really have to have a right marriage with the right publisher, because we also have fragile egos at times. We want to make sure that the publisher supports us, and I found that they've been top notch, and so I'm delighted that you're going back with them for the next book. That's great.
I mean, for me, it's been the publisher, but it's also been the individual editor. And so about 5 of my books have been done. This is not at Regnery, with a single editor, Adam Bellow. Now, Adam Bellow is the son of the Nobel laureate Saul Bellow.
Wow.
And he was in his 20s when he published my first book, Illiberal Education. He had come to the Free Press out of the University of Chicago. He had studied under Alan Bloom and some of the so-called Straussians that taught there. And Adam, of course, came from this kind of very established, American literary royalty family. But he had a philosophical disposition, and so he's become one of my closest friends over the years. And so that kind of philosophical friendship, if you will. And at Regnery, I had an editor, Harry Crocker, who's been
That's
there
my guy.
Years. Yeah, Harry's just the salt of the earth. He's this dry guy. He's
I'm in love with the guy.
He's an Anglophile. He's very interested in history. And so I've just had a beautiful relationship with Harry over the years, and just a very good kind of, again, political partnership in the books I've done with Regnery.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Harry, because I didn't know if you wanted to release the names of the editors that you worked with, although I suppose that they're public. Both of my books, I mean, the one that I'm working on now and the first one, I insisted that it be Harry. And I said, it has to be you. I said, look, being my editor, the most important thing is trust, right? So I've got to feel that, you're going to be I'm not the type of guy, by the way, who sends out my manuscripts to 1 million people to read and give feedback to. I'm extremely protective. But if I find the right person that I can trust with my words, you've written 1 million books. So, you've sat there every day toiling over every word and every comma. When you now give your baby to someone, you want to be able to trust that person. And I tell you, on The Parasitic Mind, his main feedback was, I had submitted, I think, something like 93,000 words, give or take. And the contract originally stipulated 70,000 words. But of course, you as the author, you think that every single word is necessary to be there. I mean, I remember I was sitting at the cafe for 4 hours writing those 4 sentences. Now you want them cut? And then he very gently said to me, look, the book is fantastic. It's going to be a huge success. It's too long. Please consider. And it was very polite, right? I think it'll be a much better, book that everybody wants to turn and get through it in one sitting, or whatever the term is, if we bring it down. And I, with complete humility, I listened to him. I went back. I cut out about 20,000 plus words, and I'm happy to say that he was right.
Absolutely. No, that's very often what an editor brings, and editors are different by temperament. So Adam, for example, does not edit my books in the normal way. He doesn't go through them line by line. He doesn't do any of that. He's interested in the fundamental, the philosophical thrust of the book, the single art. Books should be threaded by a single big idea or a single argument. And so he's always looking to see, is there like a break in the tension? Does the argument lapse at any point? And so his focus really is on getting your idea really clear. And then he leaves it to me to sort of execute it. It's almost like, let's get the blueprint of the building right, and then you go build the building, and I'm just going to stand and kind of watch and chuckle and enjoy the whole process. But I'm not going to come in and start fiddling with the paint in this room or that room. That's not my job. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, you call it blueprint. I call it with my students when I'm giving them feedback when they send me, first draft of a thesis. I call it the roadmap. And I keep writing, where's the roadmap? There's no roadmap. I don't know where's the unfolding story. I don't know what the narrative is. And it sounds conceptually as though it's an easy thing to do, but it isn't, right? And I can see how, in version 4 of a student's thesis, how much we've come. I'm telling them, you're telling a story, right? Whether you're writing a scientific paper or a thesis or, books to be consumed by the masses, you're a storyteller. You have to, as you said, build the tension. There is a rhythm. There's a cadence. Where am I in the story? And I think for starting authors, it's very difficult to get that concept. Do you think it's something that is innate in us, or is this something that we can truly teach people to be good at?
Well, I think like a lot of things, I compare it, say, to tennis. You can, with a good coach, learn to hit some basic good shots. You can learn a little bit of strategy, but at a certain level, and I would say by and large, when you're in a certain domain, it's not enough to have mastered the craft. You have to have that gift, the feel for it.
Absolutely.
I worked very hard to cultivate this in speaking. In other words, speaking is an art, and it's a different art than writing. In speaking, I think a key element is to be able to read the audience and literally feel the audience. So that if you are ever drifting off, if the audience is losing interest, you pick up on it in a sense even before they do, and you can immediately modify and go in a different direction. I would sometimes watch Reagan speeches mainly for just one issue, timing. Reagan was a genius in the matter of timing, and you would see this in Reagan's jokes. He knows exactly when to pause and when to then drop the punchline, and he has the perfect facial expression when he does. It's a mixture of, it's a wry smile, but he's not laughing at his own joke. You're laughing, he's not laughing, but he's letting you know by the glimmer in his eye that he knows that he's got you with that one. So it's all that chemistry that goes into the way you deliver a line. And you can learn by observation, but I think you must also have the natural feel to be able to really pull it off at the best level.
Yeah, we started our semester, my teaching semester, just a few weeks ago, and we're into week 2 now. And the issue of nature versus nurture came up, and of course, most things, it's an inextricable mix of both. But we were talking about, is humor innate? Or can you teach it in a seminar? Is charismatic leadership innate, or can you teach it in a seminar? Now, if I am in the business of making money through seminars, then I'm going to try to convince people that, no, don't worry, come to my 1, 2, 3 seminar and I'll teach you to be funny. But the reality is, as you said, that much of it is innate. Yes, there are certain rules of thumbs that I can use in terms of how to create the tension before I tell a punchline or something. But the reality, if I may say, a lot of people think that, I have a rather unique sense of humor in terms of how I use satire and sarcasm. I mean, I didn't go to a seminar on sarcasm by Voltaire to learn how to do this. It just, I can remember when I was 7 and 8 years old, my mother in Arabic would say, "Oh, you have such a sharp, ironic tongue." In Arabic. So that was something that was there. Nobody socialized me when I was 7 to know how to do that, how to mock some absurdity and so on. So I think you're exactly right.
The reason it's kind of interesting because the reason I got into American colleges is because when I was a kid, maybe about 10, I was once, I came across a word in the Times of India, which is the kind of Indian version of the New York Times, that I'd never seen before. And I was interested in words. So I was like, wow. And so I go to the dictionary and I begin to sort of digest the different meanings of the word. And then the idea crossed my mind, I should memorize the dictionary. So I start memorizing the dictionary. And I have my brother and sister open to random pages in the dictionary, ask me the most difficult word they can find, and I'll tell them what the meaning of it is. And we do this for like 2 years. So then I come to America. And while I mentioned, I'm in this public school in Arizona, my high school counselor says, in order to get into college, you have to take a test. And I'm like, oh no, I've never studied American history. There's a lot of stuff that American kids know that I don't. But he goes, no, the test is basically in 2 things, vocabulary and math. And so to my unbelievable good luck, the 2 things that I'm actually extremely good at happen to be the 2 exact things that they're going to measure in getting into college. So again, the love of words and language, to me, that is innate. Because I have that, my brother and sister do not have it to the same degree, and I've worked hard to develop it, but that's the case of nurture following nature.
Yeah, beautiful. Just since we were talking about Reagan, how often did you closely interact with him so that you're able to say, oh, here are some great stories that I can share with the audience?
Well, I'll just share one, and to
Sure.
be honest, I was not a member of the senior staff. In fact, I worked for something called the Domestic Policy Council. It's the DPC. It's the domestic equivalent of the National Security Council.
Okay.
But I was just a staffer. So what that means is that there'll be a room, and here's Reagan, and he's sitting with 10 guys on the table, and then there's about 10 of us standing in the back of the room with a notepad. We do not participate. We don't say anything, but we can listen and we can watch. And for me, it was extremely interesting to watch Reagan because there would be animated debates about some issue, let's say farm price supports or affirmative action, and there's Ed Meese and there's Pat Buchanan, and they're kind of going at it, and Reagan is fully engaged for about 10 minutes. And then if the thing starts going on and on, I can see that Reagan becomes withdrawn. Reagan checks out. And so these guys are still going at it, and then I'm kind of watching Reagan, and I notice that he looks down and there's a big jar of jelly beans on the table. And so Reagan kind of reaches over and slides the jar. And then I notice that he's sorting the jelly beans by color, putting the reds into one. And I'm thinking to myself, this is really, what's going on here? But I realized with Reagan that this was a guy who focused on the macro of things, not the micro. Because I learned later that when the Grenada operation was being planned with Reagan, in comes the military, they've got all these maps, they're trying to explain to Reagan, the commander who's in charge of the operation, we're going to do this, and we're going to land on this bridge, and we're going to do this, and Reagan just kind of taps him on the shoulder and goes, son, I'm confident that you know what you're doing, you don't have to show all of this to me, just kind of go out and do it. So wow. That was Reagan.
That's amazing. I recently chatted with, Dean Cain, Superman. Do you know who that is? And so he tells the story of when he was early in his career, as a young actor. Apparently, I'm going to botch the story, so I don't remember the exact details, but apparently Reagan, called for him. He said, oh, this young man seems interesting. I'd like to meet him. And as Dean and I were chatting, I said, I of course, I've never met any of these people. I'm sitting up in Canada. But I use sort of a pretty diagnostic test in that when you see these people, there are all sorts of cues that you're picking up that allows you to, if you're astute about human behavior, to kind of get a general schema as to who they are. And so if I look at Reagan, he strikes me as the type of guy that if I was sitting to dinner with him, I would really like him. He's just a cool guy. Whereas, if I look, and so I'm not talking policy here, I'm talking about the personhood of that individual. Whereas when I think about Obama, he truly strikes me as a narcissist. There would be no room for you to be able to engage him because he is King Obama and he sucks all of the attention of that room. Trump, in a sense, is similar. In a different way, but he too would be the type of guy who probably would not have the generosity of spirit to say, hey, I'd like to know about you. It's about me, me, me. Am I at all correct in those general perceptions?
I agree with those 100%. And I've had pretty close exposure to early, all three, not being in the same room with Obama, but I've studied Obama with care. Yes, it's absolutely right. See, with Reagan, if Reagan was sitting with somebody like Friedrich Hayek, let's say, and Hayek was talking about economics, and Hayek was talking about something quite obscure, like Hayek talks about what's going on Lexington and 29th Street in New York right now, and who's in the best position to know that? Is it the government? Or is it the guy who operates a hot dog stand at that exact intersection? Doesn't that guy understand the movement of things, including the commerce of it? Because he's local, he's on the scene. So, and then Hayek will develop some term that the information society or something like that. And the thing about Reagan is Reagan would cock his ear up and go, the information society. Well, what do you mean by that? So Reagan was interested in Solzhenitsyn. This is why Reagan could keep a friendship with William F. Buckley. Now, Reagan didn't have 1/3 of the vocabulary of Buckley. He wouldn't have read, church documents, for example, the way Buckley did. But Reagan was intrigued by ideas. And when I visited years later his ranch in Santa Barbara in the mountains, you can see that he's got all these books like Whittaker Chambers' book Witness, which is, a very long book about Chambers' conversion away from communism. And if you open the book, there's Reagan's handwriting in the margins on page after page after page. So it's a book he read with care.
That's amazing. Let's go to your studying English background, because I'd like to Darwinize English literature for a second, and you'll understand in a minute what I mean by that. And then we could talk about all sorts of recent current events if you'd like. But I got to tell you, I'm really enjoying this free-flowing conversation. Thank you, Dinesh. So English literature, so often people say, well, where can you apply the evolutionary lens to? What are some disciplines where you can or can't? And I usually answer, not facetiously, but very, very truthfully, that anything that involves biological beings is amenable to an evolutionary analysis, right? Nothing exists outside of our biology. And so let's take an example that epitomizes the humanities, that feels as though it's non-scientific, and let me discuss ways by which you can Darwinize English literature, and then I'd love to take your take on it. But before I do, and not to put you on the spot, do you have any idea what I might mean by Darwinizing literary criticism?
No, I'm actually very intrigued as to where you're going with this.
That's great.
Say, that even as someone who's done a lot of work in Christian apologetics, I'm relatively one of the few people who is in that area that embraces evolution across the board.
Oh, that's great.
You've got some of these Christian evolutionists and theists, and they'll say, well, I agree with microevolution, but I don't agree with macro. They're always trying to say that it's right to this degree, but it got it wrong on that. And what I've done is actually focus my work in a different direction, which is to ask questions. And by the way, I'm not alone in doing this. There's a biologist, you probably know his work, Simon Conway Morris. Yeah. He's done work on the Burgess Shale out of either Oxford or Cambridge. And so the question I've looked at in evolution is this: is evolution directional in any way? Or was Richard Dawkins right when he said that if you rewind the tape of life all the way back, we would come out radically differently if you played the tape again? And there's a debate within evolutionary biology on this very point. That's something that's intrigued me. But no, when you say Darwinizing literature, I'm waiting to see what you're going to say.
So we could certainly get into what you just discussed. And I remember, I think you had told me offline that had we had more time when you kindly invited me on your show, we might have talked about this. So we can certainly talk about it now or table it for another one. Anyways, we can decide later. But so let me go with Darwinian literary criticism. So typically what happens with literary criticism is you have some preferred lens through which you want to analyze literary text. I'm coming from a feminist perspective. I'm coming from a Marxist perspective. I'm coming from a postmodernist perspective. And now you will view that narrative through that particular lens. It's about class struggle, it's about the patriarchy, it's about relativism, and so on. Okay. Well, what Darwinian literary criticism does is it says, wait a second, to the extent that literature captures us, activates our emotions, the fact that I could listen or watch or read a poem from 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, where the guy doesn't know what an iPhone is or what a plane is, but I can completely understand what he's saying in this poem. He's talking about, sexual betrayal. He's talking about paternity uncertainty. He's talking about sibling rivalry. He's talking about status seeking. So there's a few universal Darwinian themes that drive much of literature, right? So literature is a window to our human nature. And so what I argue in several of my books is that in the same way that a paleontologist uses skeletal remains to construct the phylogenetic history of a species, right? I mean, I could say things about the mating behavior of a species that has now been extinct for 65 million years because of those skeletal and fossil remains. Well, the human mind doesn't fossilize, but the cultural products that it leaves behind is akin to a fossil. So I could study the content of those cultural products, including literature, to posit something about the universality of human nature. What do you think of all this?
No, this is fantastic. I mean, I would put it slightly differently. We have a lot of emphasis in academia today on diversity. And the not just diversity in America, but let's just say global diversity. And so the idea here is you go to other cultures and you try to kind of present the ecosystem in those cultures. And then, of course, the underlying idea is that all cultures have a certain inherent legitimacy. No culture is better or worse. This is all cultural relativism. We're all very familiar with it. But there's a completely different approach, which I would describe as the approach, let's say, of the ancient Greeks, the Herodotean approach to history. So Herodotus believed that history is universal. But in order to find out what is universal, you have to go to different cultures and you have to compare and contrast. Your idea is not to affirm diversity for its own sake. You're actually trying to find the best. You're trying to find the best ideas. You're trying to find what systems of marriage work best. You're trying to find, for example, which cultures have, for example, made the most breakthroughs in philosophy, for example. So diversity is not an end in itself, but it is a kind of harvesting ground for the inquiring mind to be able to separate what the Greeks called is natural from what is conventional. Right. What's conventional is local and particular. What is natural is what's universal. What's delivered by nature itself. And that's, of course, the area of Darwinian biology that you're talking about. So to me, there's a way of looking at this through philosophy that nevertheless overlaps closely with what you're saying, which is to say, what is the biological universality that we can find, whether we're reading, the Tale of Genji or the Bhagavad Gita, or whether we're reading Jane Austen, you're going to see certain human themes emerge that would be of interest to someone with a kind of liberal, in the small L sense, biological mind.
Exactly right. But incidentally, since you mentioned the ancient Greeks, in writing the current book that I'm working on, I wanted to look at the various traditions, past traditions that have studied things like, what are the prescriptions to well-being and to happiness? And that's probably one of the questions that is most addressed by philosophers of all ilk, and certainly the ancient Greeks. And as I was reading I think I had, more knowledge about the ancient Greeks than the average person, but I'm hardly a classicist. And as I kind of jumped into that literature, I would just and I actually put out a tweet maybe a month ago. I said, God damn, I don't know what they had in the water, the ancient Greeks, but it seems like they've covered everything, right? I mean, it seems like some of the insights that, I'm super excited about because somebody published a paper in some super prestigious psychology journal, 7 years ago. I can point to some guy in ancient Greece who said the exact same thing without all the statistical analyses and the scientific method, but they had already had those insights. So it really is unbelievable what those guys must have had in their water to be able to generate this profound knowledge in all areas of human import. It's unreal.
Unreal. I mean, think of someone like Democritus. Without doing a single experiment, he goes that you look at the diversity of things in the world, none of which seem to really resemble each other. And he goes, well, I think that all these different things are really made out of one thing, that if you drill down small enough, the Greeks thought about questions like if you take a glass of water and pour half of it out and you keep doing that, will you always have water? Or will at some point you reach a point where no, you can't break that down any further? And so these questions, which are really at the foundation of modern physics, for example, the discovery of the atom, the probing of the atom, all of that was philosophically anticipated by the Greeks.
But so what I mean, this may be a too difficult question, but let's take a crack at it. So what was it in the water? What is it in the was it the way that the schools were structured? Was it, facetiously something in the water? Was it their love of philosophizing for no other reason than to be a philosopher? What is it that made those folks so uniquely incredible in generating knowledge that is so unbelievably profound?
I have to say, there was a book, I think, written by the classicist Edith Hamilton, and it was literally called The Greek Miracle. And I don't know of another way to describe it, because if you think about it, even before Socrates, the so-called pre-Socratics, right? These are the very first guys giving a stab at philosophy. And even though their writings are very fragmentary, and we have very few of them in original form, we just have quotations here and there, they are raising just fundamental questions about change, about motion. They're looking at, can the world be understood mathematically? The Greeks invent not just philosophy, they invent the theater. They invent ancient democracy, which is, of course, direct democracy. So you've got these breakthroughs in so many different areas, and they're all occurring in one place within a space of about a century and a half. The 5th century BC is absolutely the high point of Greece. And they're doing all of this in the middle of a terrible war, the Peloponnesian War, which will last for over 20 years. And basically, Greece is defeated, never to rise again. So this is just such a strange episode in the history of humanity. And then you look across the pond, you look over to India, you look over to China, and there are interesting things happening in those civilizations, but I think nothing to compare with the splendor of ancient Greece.
Well, I mean, you pointed to the fact that eventually, of course, the ancient Greek civilization was no longer. Let's see if we can be optimistic, or maybe we'll be pessimistic. Is the United States, if we look down the lens of the future going to head the way of the ancient Greeks, or can we have a optimistic take that we're going to recover from all the what I call the idea pathogens that have infected the Western mind?
So I'm I would say an optimist by temperament, but I do think that we are rapidly moving out of an era that I've lived through now for most of my adult life, and I would call that the era of American privilege. I was on a cruise about 15 years ago in the Middle East. This was a cruise through Riyadh and then down to Cairo, just a number of the Muslim countries I had never been to. And when we were in Saudi Arabia, well, you get off the ship, the women have to put on an abaya. You can't walk around, so they hand you these abayas. And basically the Europeans, people all over the world were like, yeah, give me my abaya. When in Rome, do like the Romans and so on. But the Americans were like, I'm not going to put on an abaya. Huh? And it was interesting to hear American women basically say, I'm an American, meaning I'm not going to play by the same rules as everybody else. I'm special. My passport is better than everybody else's passport. And the interesting thing was everybody on the cruise agreed. In other words, the American superiority was taken for granted. And I think that's been the case since World War II. But I'm seeing that rapidly erode really before our eyes. So is America finished? I wouldn't go that far. But is the era of American dominance in which America, like the old Coca-Cola ad, is it, in which everybody wants to be more like the Americans and walk like them and talk like them, and American universities are presumptively the best in the world. I think we're going to see in the next 20 years that elite families around the world are not necessarily going to send their kids to American universities.
Yeah, I know, I hear you. Now, do you think the fact that you and I are both immigrants, I mean, in my case to Canada, although I've lived for many years in the U.S., I'm sort of an honorary American, if only because of that, and certainly because of my love for the ideals that the United States stands for. And of course, you too, you're an immigrant. Think about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who comes from the background. And I do get the feeling, I mean, although this is going to be anecdotal, but I think that if we probably did an empirical study, we'd find that some of the most dogged defenders of the Western traditions in today's contemporary reality are folks who have buffeted, if I could put the buffet as a verb, into the panoply of other cultures, recognizing that there is a miraculous reality, an anomaly in the history of humanity called the West, called the United States, and therefore having experienced those other things, we can truly appreciate and not be ingrates about what the U.S. is or Canada, and therefore we defend it with greater alacrity. Do you think there's some value to that position?
Yes, I do. Not only is it the fact that the immigrant has an actual lived experience in another culture, but I think what happens is, I remember several years ago I was doing a debate with Jesse Jackson at Stanford. We were debating, is America a racist society? And so my strategy was, I said, hey, Reverend Jackson, look, you can hold up your hand. I'll put my hand right next to it. We're exactly the same color. I said, now, this is a big country. If you're trying to show me an example of racism, I'm sure you can find it in a big country. But show me a racism today in America that's going to prevent my daughter or your kids from achieving the American dream. Where's that kind of racism? Show it to me right now. And interestingly, he was like, how he plays with his mustache and so on. His basic theme was, I can't show it to you, but that's not because the racism has gone away. It's just gone underground. It's covert racism. And I was like, wow. But as I was listening to him, I was thinking to myself, why is it the case that he and I see this country so differently? It's kind of like we're two guys sitting at a cafe, they look and they see an accident on the street, but they give radically different accounts of it. How is that really possible? And I think I finally figured it out. It occurred to me that, look, I, as an immigrant, I'm always comparing America to some other existing culture. I'm using a comparative or historical basis of comparison, and I realized that never does Jesse Jackson do that. He's using what can be called the utopian standard. Let's compare America to the Garden of Eden, And so naturally he finds America falls woefully short. And what's interesting to me is he develops an indignation based upon that, and he begins to revile America for not living up to what is often the American standard itself.
Wow, what a subtle point. I mean, in psychology, decision making, we often study things like, how do you do comparative calculus, right? I mean, so for example, if I want to decide if I'm happy, I could compare myself to relevant others. I could compare myself to how I thought I would be at this stage 5 years ago when I made that comparison. I could compare myself now to where I'm hoping to be in 5 years and if I'm on the right trajectory. So if I alter the metric of comparative calculus, I come up with completely different realizations of my current well-being. And so that's exactly what you're saying in terms of your comparison to that. I love that. Okay, let's talk very briefly, and then we'll wrap it up with any promotional things that you'd like to talk about, if you have any. It's difficult to go through your bio without recognizing that you are someone, whether you mean it, whether you are a willful provocateur, or whether it just comes to you because of your style of engagement or whatever, you're divisive, right? So for example, if I say, hey, I'm appearing on Dinesh D'Souza's show, and I'm just excited because he strikes me like a cool guy and I'm going to have a fun conversation, then I look at some of the comments, oh my God, are you insane? You're going, and I'm like, I didn't even know that he was so controversial. Maybe I'm too naive. And then so I start looking, and of course I see some people love you, some people hate you. So number one, is this something that, we're all human. We all don't like if people say bad things about us. Of course, some of us can do this, and some of us have thicker or thinner skins. How do you deal? You're certainly one of the most divisive people in the public sphere. How do you deal with it? Does it roll off you, or does it ever, eat away at you?
No, quite honestly, it not only rolls off me, but there's a little bit of me, and I don't think I'm normal in this regard, that enjoys it.
Because it brings attention to you? Why is it? Because...
No, it's not that. It's that a little part of me is detached from myself and observing myself in the arena and kind of enjoying the show. Let me give a very recent example. I was trending on Twitter yesterday, but let me tell you why. So I've been following this somewhat comic situation with Nicki Minaj.
Oh yes, I did a clip about her yesterday. Go ahead.
Yes. So here's Nicki Minaj, and she's obviously gives this preposterous story about her cousin and swollen testicles and so on. So I go on my podcast, and of course I talk about it intelligently. I say, well, look, this is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which is just because something comes after something else doesn't mean it was caused by it, right? I mean, I take the vaccine, I get in a car accident, the vaccine didn't cause the car accident. So I do all this. But then I see an article, supposedly a fact check, and it says that the health minister of Trinidad has claimed that this article, that Nicki Minaj's claim, is disinformation. So I read the article thinking, how on earth would they find out if this was disinformation? This guy claims that his testicles were swollen. Did they actually measure his testicles? So I wrote a very wry, very tongue-in-cheek response, basically saying, this fact check seems to me kind of bogus. I see no indication that they even measured his testicles. What kind of fact check is this? So then I get, this huge torrent of attacks on Twitter. They go, Tucker Carlson and Dinesh are rushing to the defense of Nicki Minaj. And I'm like, no, anyone who could actually read would see that I'm being ironic. I'm actually having sort of fun with the whole thing. I'm getting into the spirit of it. I'm also playing on the idea that most of these fact checks that we see on social media are bogus. In other words, what they do is they take legitimate differences of opinion and they portray them as differences of fact. And they take the fact that they don't agree with you and basically say you're putting out misinformation. You're not putting out misinformation. You're just not saying what they agree with. So my tweet was really an attempt to goad this bogus fact-checking industry. And so this is the kind of thing I do. So I kind of know that I'm kind of poking where it's going to make people jump. But my goal is always to stimulate a kind of reaction and an argument.
Right. Well, the gist of my very short clip yesterday on Nicki Minaj was that I wasn't taking a position about the veracity of her position. Right? All that I was saying is that, in chapter 8 of the Parasitic Mind, I talk about activate your inner honey badger, right? I'm compelling people that if they have a position that they think they can, that is well articulated, what the veracity of that position is something different. The epistemological truth of it is different. But the fact that if you are sufficiently confident in a position, that you should at least have the intellectual honesty and testicular fortitude, since we're talking about testes, to be able to stand up and say, I'm going to defend those principles. And I was saying that she is a honey badger, whether we agree with her or not. And then, of course, I got not nearly the same kind of venom that you did, but some people said, well, how could you be? You're the man of science. You're the reason guy. You're the truth teller. Why are you supporting this? I said, I'm not talking about the veracity. It's just the fact that in a world of castrated cowards, the fact that someone can stand up, like Nicki Minaj, I said, has bigger balls than most men in academia. And that's something that's laudable. And it ends there, right?
Well, this is the point. I mean, I think the really explosive quote by Nicki Minaj was not about COVID. It was when she said, listen, basically when a Democrat says something and hands us blacks, a bunch of marbles, we're supposed to stick those marbles up our anus. Yeah. In other words, we're supposed to obediently do what the Democrats say. And this was really what Joy Reid was trying to pull on Nicki Minaj. Joy Reid was trying to be, I'm, the academic, I'm the intellectual, and so you, Nicki Minaj, you better sing out of my hymn book, so to speak.
It's so true.
I think what Nicki Minaj did was she goes, I'm not going to, and so the refusal to accept the moral authority. In a sense, she was also turning the tables, because in a sense what Nicki Minaj was basically saying is that you, Joy Reid, are sort of policing the plantation for the Democrats. Right. And I, Nicki Minaj, don't want to be on it. Yeah. And I think this was her real heresy, and this is why they're also nervous. They want to whip her into line, because it's just not good for them to have someone so prominent, whom they can't portray as some kind of a quote Uncle Tom. Nicki Minaj is about, she's a very successful rapper with a huge following, so she was off the reservation, and that was the whole sort of subtext of what was going on.
And I got the feeling that there was some saltiness when she said, I've got 2 million followers and you've got 22 million followers. It was part humble brag and part saltiness. I am the intellectual. She's hardly that. Who went, I don't know, maybe to Harvard, whereas, you're just, a rapper, and how could it be that I've got 10 times fewer followers than you? That's kind of the subtext that I read there. Does that sound reasonable?
No, absolutely. And even the kind of, what Joy Reid was doing was, because she kept referring to Nicki Minaj as sort of sister, like sister. Let me kind of tell you how it really is, this kind of thing. I want to appeal to your better self. I do not think Joy Reid expected that Nicki Minaj would turn around and fire back. So that was the big surprise. And of course, Joy Reid has not been heard from since on this topic. So I found the whole thing just extremely entertaining, and that's why I jumped into it.
Fantastic. Okay, last question. Of course, we could have this conversation for 5 hours, and I hope that you will come back on the show at some point.
I love it.
This is really great. Are there any, not that you need my platform to promote your stuff, you've got a much bigger platform, but is there anything that's exciting you that's coming up that you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I'll just mention my daily podcast, because that's something I'm doing that's new. I started it the middle of January, and it's kind of a unique podcast in that it deals with politics, that's its primary topic, but it also deals with history and philosophy and literature. Right now, for example, I'll do typically those segments at the end of the podcast. I'm doing, for example, right now, I'm covering the debate between Martin Luther, of course, the founder of the Reformation, and Erasmus, the great Catholic humanist, on the issue of free will. A very important debate that actually has a secular counterpart that goes on in neuroscience and philosophy, but this was the Christian version of it. Ultimately, Martin Luther King, of course, taking the position that, divine grace is all that is necessary for salvation. And of course, Erasmus taking the position, well, wait a minute, if that were true, everybody would in fact be saved. Isn't there a human action that has to sort of accept or reject this grace that is being offered by God? And so you've got this remarkable debate in which Luther goes, well, you need grace to accept grace. And so you can see how that pushes in a predestinarian direction at the end of the day, because it's sort of like God must choose in advance that this guy and this guy and this guy are the three guys I want in heaven, and I don't want these other guys. And Erasmus, of course, is recoiling as this kind of, humanist who basically believes, no, it is human choice and the consequences of those choices that matter most in the end. So, this very interesting debate, but it's not the normal fodder for a typical political podcast. And so I give my audience, it's very much my kind of the way I like to look at things. But it's the first time I've had a podium of my own. I mean, I do the books periodically, the movies periodically, but I haven't had a regular platform. I'm really enjoying the podcast. So I do it daily for an hour, audio and video, just the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
Oh, fantastic. You know, I have found that I started my show about 7 years ago, and I'm like a kid in a candy store because, you know, I can't think of a single guest that I've ever had on my show where I wasn't, you know, a priori excited like a little child to be speaking to them. And the fact that, you know, if you're doing something innovative, something, you know, genuine, something authentic, that, you know, thousands, if not millions of people then flock to you is truly humbling, and it is so exciting. And so on that note, thank you so much for contributing to that excitement. It's such a joy to speak to you, Dinesh. I look forward to having many more conversations. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. Thanks again for being on. Cheers.
My pleasure.
All right.